Somalia is a country often mentioned as one of the most suffering states in the world. Stories of famine, armed conflicts, piracy, and natural disasters have forged in the global consciousness the image of a territory where chaos, poverty, and constant upheavals reign. However, when we speak of the most suffering country, we must not forget the real people, their daily lives, their hopes, and aspirations for a better future. To understand why Somalia is so often at the epicenter of humanitarian crises, it is essential to investigate the roots of its problems, historical origins, social and political particularities, geopolitical position, and the inquiry and influence of external forces. Located in the east of the Horn of Africa, Somalia possesses a unique geographical location. On one hand, it boasts an extensive coastline facing the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, which in theory could foster commercial flourishing. But at the same time, this very coast became a focal point for Somali piracy, aggravated after the weakening of the central government. The geopolitical relevance of the region is due not only to maritime trade routes, but also to its proximity to unstable areas and the strategic global interests of various powers. The key to understanding Somalia's current challenges lies in the combination of internal contradictions and external interference, which sometimes takes the form of political military operations or indirect support for specific factions. Historically, Somalia was not always plunged into such a state of chaos. Before the era of colonization, the territory inhabited by Somali clans was part of trade routes connecting East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and even India. Prosperous port cities stood there. The population participated in caravan trade, and handicrafts and agriculture developed. However, the arrival of European colonial powers, mainly Great Britain and Italy, led to the division of the region into spheres of influence, laying the groundwork for future conflicts, as a unified system of government was never established. After independence in 1960, Somalia faced difficulties related to defining its national identity, the scarcity of solid power structures, and interclan rivalry. Political instability and the extent of authoritarian tendencies only intensified internal tensions. The culmination of this internal instability came in 1991, when Mohammed Siad Barre's regime was overthrown, de facto plunging the country into civil war. The central government collapsed, and Somalia's territory began to fragment under the influence of various armed groups, each controlling a specific area. Semi-autonomous regions like Puntland, Somaliland, and southern Somalia emerged, where the struggle for resources and power continued for decades. The lack of a solid government was the main factor fostering the rise of extremism, piracy, and the humanitarian crisis. Multiple international community efforts to stabilize the region, including UN and African Union military missions, did not achieve the desired effectiveness given the complex and intricate clan structure governing Somali society. The inability of so much state effort to guarantee security on land largely led to sailors suffering from piracy off the Somali coast. The hijacking of merchant ships, the taking of their crews hostage, and the demand for enormous ransom sums became tragically famous phenomena in the early 2000s. For many young people in coastal areas, without the possibility of earning a legal living, piracy was sometimes the only opportunity to obtain money or simply survive. The international community responded by reinforcing military presence in the Gulf of Aden, creating coalitions and task forces to combat pirates. Over time, piracy decreased, but the daily problems of Somalis persisted. The root of the situation, poverty and unemployment, had not been eradicated. Another sinister threat to Somalia's citizenry are extremist groups, especially Al-Shabaab, linked to Al-Qaeda. These militants, taking advantage of the absence of a strong government, controlled large territories of the country and established strict laws and repressive measures. Attacks, kidnappings, and assaults against civilians and international organization workers became part of the tragic routine in many areas. The incessant series of clashes between government forces, backed by foreign peacekeeping contingents and al-Shabaab fighters, only worsens the humanitarian situation, as the civilian population, schools, and hospitals are exposed to crossfire. People are forced to flee, becoming internally displaced or fleeing outside the country in search of refuge. Natural disasters also have a strong impact on the lives of Somalis. Droughts, floods, and periodic outbreaks of famine have aggravated an already critical situation on multiple occasions. For example, in 2011, Somalia suffered one of the most destructive droughts in recent decades, which led to mass famine and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Agriculture, dependent on rainfall and seasonal rivers, is completely blocked in cases of intense drought. Meanwhile, food shortages occur in cities and disputes over water and pastures intensify in rural areas. Often, when the rains finally arrive, they are so strong that they cause floods, sweeping away precarious crops and destroying scarce infrastructure. Meanwhile, international humanitarian organizations try to help the Somali population by sending food, water, medicine, and rebuilding schools and hospitals. But the inhabitants face enormous daily challenges. Electricity, if available, is often unstable and expensive, and drinking water is scarce. Health centers operate intermittently, and doctors and supplies are lacking. The risk of infectious disease spread, such as cholera, increases when people cannot maintain minimal hygiene standards. Vaccination campaigns are irregular, leading to outbreaks of diseases that have already been eradicated in most countries. Women and children are in an especially vulnerable situation. In a context of permanent conflict and insecurity, they face violence, forced marriages, and discrimination in education and healthcare. Many girls do not even receive primary education, as their families prefer them to stay home to help with domestic chores or fear sending them to school due to the threat of armed groups. The risk of falling into human trafficking is also very high. As economic opportunities dwindle, the burden of survival falls mostly on women, who try to support their families through exhausting and poorly paid jobs, or by being forced to accept insecure livelihoods. In this environment, childhood almost vanishes for the youngest. Many become orphans, or even end up in the hands of armed groups, who use them as combatants, porters, or human shields in clashes. The lack of schools, the scarcity of teachers, and the frequent closure of educational centers due to threats or attacks mean that an entire generation grows up without basic reading and writing skills. This perpetuates a vicious cycle. Without education or expectations, young Somalis find no other way out than to continue the spiral of violence and poverty. Despite everything, in Somalia, there are people who, facing adversity, try to restore hope. Some young entrepreneurs seek to develop small businesses supported by modern technologies and mobile telephony, which, despite everything, has a certain level of penetration in urban areas. Small companies offer electronic payment services, mobile banking, or set up small internet cafes where external information can be accessed. Likewise, there are local activists and organizations that, with the support of international funds, promote educational programs aimed at improving literacy and vocational training. The achievements are modest, but they exist. Educational initiatives, women's cooperatives, microcredits for artisans and farmers. However, any positive progress in Somalia is very fragile. The international community continues to provide aid, but it is often insufficient. Efforts by the UN and other organizations frequently encounter bureaucratic obstacles, security risks, and corruption. Humanitarian aid shipments may not reach those most in need, and the adoption of key measures is sometimes delayed by political disputes. The effects of climate change further complicate the situation. Repeated droughts, the depletion of water reserves, and soil degradation hit traditional agriculture, pushing the population to leave their homes and concentrate in overcrowded camps. There, new threats appear. Outbreaks of epidemics, malnutrition, and the disintegration of social networks. Given such difficulties, it is not difficult to conclude that Somalia seems destined to continue suffering and to repeat its tragedies again and again. But we must not ignore that Somalis possess an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and a great sense of dignity, which drives them to seek avenues for progress even in the most difficult conditions. The spirit of clan solidarity, traditional values of hospitality, and family cohesion help many to support each other. Despite the terrible effects of decades of war and extremism, some progress, albeit slow, can be seen towards stabilization, the establishment of more solid state institutions, the search for consensus among tribal leaders, and the fight against corruption at the local level. It is important to remember that resolving the conflict in Somalia is a long-term process that requires comprehensive measures. In addition to military support, significant investments are needed in education, health, agriculture, and infrastructure. International donors can play a fundamental role, but the definitive solution must come from within the country itself through dialogue among local communities, clan chiefs, religious leaders, and the central government. The key challenge is to find a balance between traditional forms of organization and modern institutions, taking into account the great diversity of interests and the complex history of the region. Ultimately, life in Somalia is not just about the struggle for survival. There is also a strong culture, vibrant traditions, faith in a better future, and enormous potential in human and natural resources yet to be exploited. Perhaps one day, Somalia can shed the label of the most suffering country and show the world another facet, that of a land with development prospects, and a people with a rich history and a longing for peace. However, the path to achieving this involves overcoming a series of obstacles on all fronts: military, political, economic, social, and climatic. Currently, Somalis, hostages of prolonged instability, continue to seek avenues for reconciliation and reconstruction. They accept any available work, form cooperatives to jointly purchase food and tools, and develop small productions. Simultaneously, international organizations carry out projects to improve access to drinking water, build clinics in rural areas, and train local medical and educational personnel. Global efforts are also aimed at designing sustainable agricultural practices, adapted to the region's hot and arid climate. Although these projects face numerous problems each year, they all offer a glimmer of hope. Thus, the reality of Somalia is multifaceted. The country suffers countless hardships, from armed conflicts and terrorism to famines, diseases, and natural disasters. But beyond the headlines, there is the daily life of millions of people who continue to raise children, work in the fields or in small businesses, strive to study, and help each other despite all setbacks. Somalia can be called the most suffering country if one looks at global figures and disaster statistics. But behind those numbers are personal stories, incredible human resilience, and the constant search for peace. Precisely this determination not to give up is what fuels the hope that one day Somalia will overcome the terrible consequences of its civil wars and natural disasters, find the path to development, and demonstrate how strong a country that has gone through such harsh trials can be.